Hey everyone, Steven here, and today I'm reviewing a monitor that I've had on my list to review for some time now, the Samsung Odyssey Neo G9. Now technically I've had the original G9 on my list, but this is the latest version with some big improvements to HDR. I'll cover the specs first, followed by what I like, don't like, and the gray area, which are things you may or may not care about, before wrapping the video up. For part of the specs session, I will be running video of me unboxing this also. The Samsung Odyssey Neo G9 is a 49-inch super ultra-wide VA panel monitor with a 240Hz refresh rate, a 1 millisecond gray-to-gray response time, and a 1000R curve. The resolution is 5120 by 1440p in a 32:9 aspect ratio, which makes this the size of two 27-inch monitors next to each other. The panel is comprised of quantum mini LEDs with a minimum brightness of 300 nits, a typical brightness of 420 nits, and a peak brightness reaching 2000 nits, making this HDR 2000, and this has 2048 local dimming zones. The static contrast ratio is 1,000,000:1, and the dynamic contrast ratio is mega. This covers 125% of the sRGB color space, 92% of the Adobe, 95% of the DCI P3, and 88% of the NTSC. The panel features a black equalizer, a low input lag mode, flicker-free technology, an eye saver mode, screen size optimizer, auto source switching, and refresh rate optimizer. This has picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture, FreeSync Premium Pro, and is G-Sync compatible. For ports, you have one DP 1.4, two HDMI 2.1, two USB 3.0 ports, and a headphone jack. Inside the box, you will find the power cable, HDMI cable, DP cable, USB extension cable, and the user manual. For mechanical adjustments, this can raise 120mm plus or minus 5mm. This can swivel 15 degrees to the left or right plus or minus 2 degrees, and can tilt 3 degrees forwards plus or minus 2 degrees, and tilt back 13 degrees plus or minus 2 degrees. On the back of the monitor, you will find the Infinity Core lighting, which has see-through plastic around it, with the rest of the molding of this whole monitor mainly being white shiny plastic, which only the top-tier Odyssey monitors have. The stand has a built-in headphone holder, and the stand has the cable management opening built into it, with the cover sliding up to allow access and then sliding back on to cover it up. On the bottom right hand side, you will find a single dial menu button and the 3 preset buttons for quickly toggling between 3 different gaming configurations you want. This is VESA mount compatible with a 100mm by 100mm pattern, and the monitor weighs 32 pounds with the stand and 26.2 without. For this video, I've been running firmware version 1007.3, which I will talk about again in a little bit. So now that I've covered these specs, let's talk about what I like about this monitor, starting with the main things that will most likely attract people towards buying it. The 1000R curve at 49 inches, and the HDR 2000 with the 2048 local dimming zones. For the curve, this is a unique experience with it not feeling as pronounced as you might imagine it'll feel just based on pictures of it. At least for me personally, I almost thought it would feel like it's wrapping around me, and it's not actually that big physically to wrap around you, but the curve here does feel natural to the eye, and having played on an 1800R curved 49-inch super ultra-wide monitor, there is definitely a difference you will see when using this. I personally really like the curve here, and at this size, it makes gaming feel more natural with this big of an aspect ratio. You feel more immersion in most games because this thing is so large that it will actually fill your peripheral vision with screen. The screen being this large does mean that you will be rotating your head from the left to the right to see everything depending on the depth of your desk and the task that you are performing. So my desk is only 2 feet deep, with most regular desks being closer to 3 feet, so I feel a little too close to this, and it feels like I need to sit back a little bit more from the monitor. So if you have a 2.5 or 3 foot desk, this will feel more natural. Now my solution here is to VESA mount this, which allows me more room for the monitor and the option to put this in portrait mode if I want to, although there wouldn't be much use with that just because of how big this is. The side view of the monitor really does highlight how pronounced the curve is here, and I find myself checking it every now and then just to admire how much of a curve this really is. Growing up with flat tube TVs and rounded style monitors, I never expected to see a monitor like this, and it's incredible in person. The size here is also great for content creators, whether it's having a large workspace and apps like Premiere Pro or having multiple windows open at the same time. For my voiceover work for these videos, this is great because I can keep my script open on one side of the monitor and Premiere Pro on the other side, instead of being all crammed into small windows like I do on my regular 32-inch monitors. Next, the HDR here is great with the 2048 local dimming zones. It doesn't come without any hiccups, but overall it is really good. And expect to sink some time into adjusting the panel, NVIDIA control panel, and game settings to get this just right. The HDR panel settings are different with the picture mode, allowing for HDR dynamic and standard. Now the Neo G7 that I just reviewed lets you adjust the picture settings and cycle the regular presets, while the G9 doesn't. Regardless of the dynamic or standard mode being chosen, you can adjust the brightness, contrast, sharpness, and color. You can't adjust the black level, eye saver mode, or adjust the screen position. Black level adjustment here is for HDMI optimization, so that won't be there regardless unless you actually are using an HDMI input, but black equalizer won't be available with HDR on in the game tab either. In the color tab, gamma won't be available with HDR on, but everything else is still available to adjust. The HDR dynamic seems to be the better option in my opinion, as it's more vibrant, which I prefer personally, and is one that I've been using for most of the recordings in this video. This can create oversaturation in certain instances though, which makes the image look off. For me, this was more apparent in Destiny 2 with whites leaning more blue, and it actually reminded me of the blue you see on an image when you have the negative of that image. And this was actually after spending some time trying to eliminate this as much as I could. Now, one of the features of this panel that I actually like that helps with this particular issue potentially is the 3 game preset buttons on the front, where you can actually set this to the various settings, and when you're ready to switch to something else, you just simply click that button. So if you have one for a particular game or other uses like photo editing, this is great, so you don't need to constantly be adjusting the panel settings. I really like this when it works, but that's not always the case, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Going back to the 2 HDR modes here, I do like these overall. They're really good, the different adjustments that you can make with them. I do still think it's a little bit odd that it's this way compared to the G7, which, as I remember, it actually just lets you adjust the regular presets here, and you weren't really boxed into just the 2 options, but maybe I missed something when I was adjusting that monitor. For more in-depth information about the HDR, I'll have a link for the hardware unboxed review, which covers lots of tests that I don't do on these monitors. They showcase some of the good results this monitor has in regards to the nits, as well as some of the issues with the 2 HDR modes. I'll also have a link for their quality control video, which addresses some of the HDR issues they saw in their review, more specifically the local dimming with HDR, as well as an issue with scan lines. Now, I'm running the 1007.3 firmware, and I'm happy to report I haven't had any of these issues with scan lines or the HDR here. Hopefully these firmware updates have improved the HDR and the scan lines for everybody across the board. If you are having any issues, I do recommend watching those videos just because they give such a good detailed breakdown of all the things that they were finding. Moving on, the local dimming zones here, overall really incredible. You have 2048, and this really reduces any blooming that you would get, especially when you're comparing this to the 10 local dimming zones that the original G9 had. With the screen being this large, the one downside I've noticed is the local dimming in darker areas of a game. They can actually force the whole screen to become darker. In Horizon Zero Dawn, this was very noticeable with high or auto local dimming turned on, which auto seems to be very close to high in most cases. But with this, the low local dimming is something that I found I'm using a lot more than the other 2. The G7, the Neo G7, I was using auto on that one. Here, low just seems to be the better option because I don't have as many instances where I'm finding that It's really taking whatever is dark on screen and then forcing the whole screen to go dark. That's not every game. I noticed it with the new Spider-Man game, which just launched on PC. And of course, I'll have footage showcasing this in Horizon Zero Dawn and the new Spider-Man game, so you guys can actually see what this looks like for yourself. If it's a big issue, it's one of those things where it could be an annoyance. Most people may not actually be bothered by it at all, but if it is, you can of course just turn off local dimming for that particular game. If you haven't experienced a monitor with this many local dimming zones and really good HDR, it does feel like the next step to improve the visual fidelity of games from the panel side of things. Even if a game doesn't actually technically support HDR, this will still improve the visuals and experience. For games that do allow you to adjust HDR, they have their own set of parameters for adjusting HDR, with some being simple like Halo or Spider-Man, and others being more complex like Doom Eternal. So between the panel settings, NVIDIA or AMD control panel, and the in-game settings, expect to sink some time into this when you first get it. Some games can give you adjustments to increase the nits, a little bit more specific with it, but with that, I've noticed some say like, all right, it's capped at 2000, which this is HDR 2000, and then some allow you to actually adjust that beyond 2000 nits. At 2000 nits, for me, this feels too bright. So I do like the range that this can provide in theory, but honestly, 1000 nits on this feels like the sweet spot paired with the local dimming. If you're a content creator and you need to edit HDR content, this is going to be a great monitor for you, and it should provide everything you will need in terms of the color space and the HDR capabilities. Moving on, the response time here is pretty solid with adaptive sync and variable refresh rate turned on. With those turned off, you can adjust the response time to standard, fast, fastest, and extreme low motion blur. I still don't have a trail pursuit camera, but like most other monitors, you will increase inverse ghosting as you increase the overdrive, and this seems to be a little bit more noticeable on the Neo G9 than it was on the Neo G7. I would personally leave adaptive sync and variable refresh rate on if you want a smoother playing experience that still feels responsive. In general, there is a small amount of ghosting and black trailing here, and part of that will be due to the larger size, even though this is a 1 millisecond gray to gray response time. I think with overdrive enabled, the picture quality can seem to suffer a little bit depending on the game, but you can see a small reduction in response time, so it just depends on what you're after with this. Next, the picture by picture with a monitor of this size is great, and it makes this essentially two 27-inch monitors side by side without the molding split that you would typically have in the middle. With this, you can split your PC up so you can run a game on one side and streaming software like OBS on the other, or you can run your PC on one side and a console on the other side. The curve can seem a little bit odd at first when it's split like this, but it still looks great. Last, the molding on this monitor may not be for everyone, but I really like it. The aesthetics here give this a futuristic look, and I like the white here instead of Samsung going with black, and the light on the back looks better than the other ones that come on the smaller Odyssey monitors. Although it's harder to see with this big of a monitor, I still think it looks pretty cool. Moving on, let's talk about what I don't like about this monitor, and I don't have a lot here, but the first one is a big one in my opinion, which is this only has natural support for 60, 120, and 240 Hertz. You have to create a custom refresh rate or set global or application caps to get 144 or 165 Hertz, but I think it should be included by default. I'm not sure why Samsung chose to do this because, let's be honest, most games aren't going to hit 240 Hertz. I like the 240 Hz for basic tasks, but graphically demanding games, depending on your hardware, might only hit 80 to 144 Hz. I think part of this is Samsung just future-proofing the monitor a little bit, but in the meantime, these refresh rates would have been nice to have without the need to mess with the custom route. Now, I haven't had any flickering issues like the original G7 did with the 240 Hz panel, but part of the solution there was to turn down the refresh rate, and forcing this panel down to 120 Hz from 240 seems like a waste of potential if that is an issue for anyone. Dropping this to 165 or 144 Hz from the 240 if flickering was an issue, which I know it shouldn't be anyways, but that drop feels like one I'm more willing to compromise and make compared to the 120 Hz. Next, the price here is a very steep ask. Now I got my monitor on sale for $1,800 and that feels more reasonable, although I still understand that that's very expensive, but the $2,300 price mark, it just seems way too high. This does feel like a solid $1,800 monitor, but at $2,300, I would feel like it's missing something. The lack of speakers would be a small example of that, and for $2,300, it should have built-in speakers. Another feature that wraps into what I would expect at $2,300 is more options with the picture-by-picture, as I was able to run the PlayStation and PC at the same time, and then the Xbox and PlayStation at the same time, but you lose the ability to upscale to 4K doing that. Remember, having this in split screen mode is like having two 27-inch monitors next to each other. Now in general, this is actually really great, which is why I mentioned it being something that I like, but at this price point, I would expect not to lose so many options. So no upscaling to 4K, which can be a bit of a bummer for consoles. The HDR and local dimming go away as well, which are two of the three main reasons to actually buy this monitor. So that's another hard pill to swallow. For local dimming, I imagine this goes away because it's most likely something where they couldn't really get it a straight line if you were actually splitting between two sources with this. In terms of the upscaling to 4K though, the Scepter 49-inch super ultra-wide monitor that I had and reviewed was able to actually upscale, so I'm not quite sure why Samsung with this monitor isn't able to do that. Consoles don't currently support native ultra-wide aspect ratios, so with this, if you are going to use this with just a console, I personally think that would just be a waste of your money, because what it's going to do is going to take that image and it's just going to stretch it out. So it's taking the 16:9 aspect ratio and then stretching it out to the ultra-wide aspect ratio, and it looks like a stretched image and it doesn't look that great. So hopefully the video that I'm showcasing right now of my son playing Borderlands here is helping illustrate that point. Last, let's cover the gray area stuff, starting with the wobble, which for the Neo G7, I put that in the bad section, the stuff I don't like, because the wobble was so pronounced. And here it's still there, but I think the saving grace is the monitor is so big that it doesn't do it quite as much when typing or gaming like the G7 did. Now, if I tap on it, it's still there, but again, it's not nearly as pronounced as the G7 unless you just start getting crazy with typing or shifting your desk. With it being this big and heavy though, if it takes a good bump from behind, it's potentially going to topple forward. Next, I would have liked the height adjustment here to be a bit taller, because at its tallest point, it still sits about 3 inches too low for my direct line of sight, but this increase would mean that the monitor would be more unstable with the current stand that it has, so Samsung would most likely need to actually make that bigger to accommodate this. So there would be a trade-off with this, so I don't know if that's necessarily worth it, but I'm 6 foot, it also depends on the height of your desk, so just something to consider with this. Next is an issue I've been having, but I'm not sure if it's the monitor. I do believe it's the monitor. It could be my PC, but based off what I'm finding with this, I didn't want to necessarily just put it in the bad section here, just because I'm not 100% sure which it is. So with this, the monitor has had a couple instances of not connecting to my PC or giving me an extremely dark screen after making adjustments to the panel. I haven't had any issues like this with other monitors I've been reviewing this past year, and my hardware hasn't changed, which leads me to believe that it is the actual monitor itself. So sometimes the monitor says that there isn't actually an input, and unplugging the DP cable and then plugging it back in or turning the monitor on and off doesn't do anything. So I actually have to hard reset my PC in this instance, and then it actually works fine. This usually happens when I walk away for a long period of time and leave my PC on, so I'm not sure if it's a glitch in the sleep mode of the PC or the panel itself. With certain instances, I can actually try to get it to turn on, and then I just sit here for a long period of time, and this could be 3 to 5 minutes, and then finally it'll come back on. It's not happening all of the time, but it's happening enough that it has me a little bit concerned with this. The next issue is the dark screen. That's happened a couple of times, once when adjusting the panel settings and then switching over to one of the game presets I set up in a quick succession. So I was essentially running through adaptive sync settings and then just switching this on and off, and after that I don't know, for whatever reason, I think it was going too fast for the monitor to keep up with, and then it just gives me this black screen. So in that instance, I actually have to turn the PC off and then back on, and then it's fine. So I'd keep that in mind when you're actually adjusting any of the game presets, to not switch them on and off too fast. This is something that I mentioned. I like the fact that it does have these game preset buttons, but I am finding an issue when I'm switching between these too fast. Another issue I've run into, it's a dark screen, but it's not 100% black, like there's not an input. It's more like it's blacked out, but you can see the outlines of different apps you may have open. You can even kind of see the taskbar a little bit. This is very hard to capture on camera, so my apologies there. But with this, I've had it where it's switching between different presets really quick, or the monitor is just about to hit sleep mode and I come over and start messing with it. It's only happened a handful of times with this, but it is really, really odd to see in person. Another thing where I don't think this should be an issue when you're dealing with a monitor that is this expensive. Hopefully it's just something that's happening with my monitor. Again, I don't know if it's a monitor, maybe my computer. I am really leaning heavy towards this monitor being the cause of this, just because, as I mentioned, I haven't had these same issues with any of the other monitors I've reviewed in the last year, and my hardware hasn't changed. Now, I don't think this will happen for everyone, and I'm really just giving a long-winded example of a larger problem, which is Samsung's quality control issues, which, again, I'll have the video from Hardware Unboxed covering this in the description. That video came out almost a year ago, and the problems in that seem to have been resolved at this point, but I still think Samsung has a quality control issue on their hands. We saw it with the flickering issue with the original G7, and I've heard tons of stories of people getting broken panels, whether in the form of dead pixels, flickering issues, actual cracked screens like the G70A I had, or settings causing the panel to go on the fritz. It feels like a gamble sometimes with the Samsung monitors, and at these high prices, that just shouldn't be the case. I understand there will be a handful of problems, but these seem all too common with the Odyssey series. Now, when the panels work, they are incredible most of the time, but I hate the leery feeling I get in the back of my mind that I'll get a broken monitor when I buy one. So if you've actually bought and used any of the Odyssey series monitors, I want to hear from you in the comment section. What has been your experience with that monitor, and maybe you've actually been able to try a handful of different ones, and if that is the case, how have they all compared to each other in terms of the quality control issues that Samsung is, unfortunately at this point, kind of known for. Last are a couple minor things that you might want to be aware of. Text clarity is pretty good, but more pixelated than the Neo G7 here, because you're going from 4K with the Neo G7 to 1440p with the Neo G9 here. I do recommend running ClearType in Windows to help improve this. Now, that's going to be an issue that you would have on any super ultra wide monitor at 1440p, so just keep that in mind. There is a headset holder on the back of the monitor, which I mentioned in the specs section of this video, and some of the other Odyssey monitors have that, but at this size, reaching over this panel to actually grab that headset or to put it back seems more trouble than it's worth. So it's cool that it's there. I don't know how many people will actually end up using that. Last, the local dimming as a whole is very good, but I have noticed the halo effect here is more pronounced than the Neo G7. Of course, there is a size difference here, which I talked about earlier, but the local dimming zones going from 1196 on the G7 to 2048 on the G9 would make these pretty comparable in my mind, but it's still quite noticeable. Now, it's still top tier HDR with local dimming, but certain things don't seem as good with the HDR when compared to the much cheaper, although still expensive, Neo G7. If I didn't need the bigger aspect ratio and size this has, I would personally go with the Neo G7 over this. It just feels like the perfect sweet spot in my opinion. So in conclusion, this Samsung Odyssey Neo G9 is a beast of a monitor with the three main draws of the size, HDR, and local dimming all being top notch and something that did not disappoint. Now, they did have the occasional hiccup or need for adjustments in the panel or game settings, but running the latest firmware has been smooth compared to issues at launch. Although I've run into what could potentially be some issues with sleep mode and quickly switching between presets. That may just be my panel or it may be my PC. Again, I'm not 100% sure on that. Just something to be mindful of. And I do want to stress the fact that these aren't happening all of the time, it's just happened a handful of times. The longer I've used the monitor, the more I've liked it, but ultimately I think it might just be too much monitor for me. So I would really suggest seeing this in person if possible to see if it's something that you'll really like. Otherwise, I'd be worried you may have buyer's remorse. The normal $2,300 price tag here feels a bit too steep in my opinion, so I'd wait for a sale if you can. The quality control issues here are going to be a gamble, but if you get a monitor that's in great shape, then it'll be worth it. I'll have a link for this in the description if you want to pick this monitor up, and if you have any questions about this monitor, let me know in the comment section. Well, that's going to be it for this one. If you liked the video, hit the like button for me. If you want to continue to follow along with all my content, hit the subscribe button for me. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.